Hello and welcome to the Week in Politics. My name is Professor Lain and I'm from the Centre for Change Governance here at the University of Canberra. And of course, I'm joined by the ever wonderful Michelle Grattan. Hello, Michelle.
Hi, Lain.
It's been a really interesting couple of weeks, Michelle, and Anthony Albanese's off to a running start. But today is an auspicious day, isn't it? First National Cabinet for Anthony Albanese.
Yes, that's right, and there was a dinner at the Lodge last night, and I heard Dominic Perrottet, the Liberal Premier from New South Wales, on the radio this morning saying everything seemed hunky-dory, so we'll see how that actually translates into action.
Well, one of the big topics today is going to be around Australia's energy crisis, which just seems to keep going, with a lot of blackouts feared across, well, certainly the East Coast, and people have been told to really reduce their energy consumption, which in a Canberra winter is pretty hard, I must say.
Absolutely.
So, Michelle, why has this energy crisis happened, and what is the government and the Australian energy market operator going to do about it?
There are long-term and short-term factors. The long-term factor and the really important and reprehensible political dynamic in this is that there hasn't been a proper energy policy formulated in the last decade, and we know we've had the climate wars, we know we've had the coalition resisting the move to renewables at the speed that is necessary, and we've had divisions in the coalition. So that's the long-term dimension. Short-term, there are things like the war in Ukraine, and also, of course, this very, very cold weather we've had. No sign of global warming at the moment, and that's contributed to increased demand. And also we've had some coal-fired power stations offline for maintenance or for other unexpected factors, and all those things have contributed to this crisis, and it really is a crisis. Now, the federal government has been working with the states. They announced some actions, including the formulation of a transition plan to the cleaner economy, but those things won't really address this crisis in the immediate term. We've had the Australian energy market operator step in first with a price cap and then essentially taking over the system when the price cap not only didn't solve the problem but created some new difficulties. So that's where we are at the moment. We have the system now totally regulated, and still I think that the problem is going to continue for some time.
So given this, what do you think this means for the future of Australia's coal and gas industries?
Well, obviously we're wanting to move out of coal in terms of domestic power. As for gas, I think there are different views about how much of a role it should play in the system, but it's obviously necessary in the transition phase. The federal government says, well, we've got a plan and we've got new targets for reducing emissions in the medium term, but the trouble is that, of course, the plan is going to take some time to be in full operation, quite a long time, and in the meantime, because the system is more or less broken or semi-broken, we really will have continuing problems for quite a while.
Well, that leads to the big question then, Michelle. Energy reform is really important, but does the new government have a clear energy policy?
I think its policy is clear enough, but you just have this difficulty of the long term versus the short term, or the medium term perhaps versus the short term, and it's the short term that we're living in at this instant.
Let's move slightly sideways here from energy into climate. Obviously they're very directly related. Yesterday the government officially registered under the UN's climate framework with Australia's enhanced emissions reduction target. What does this policy commitment mean for Australia internationally?
I think it makes us much more respectable internationally and in line with other countries. Of course, Australia has been criticised pretty robustly for its climate policy, inadequate targets and so on, and this does mean that I think we'll get somewhat less criticism.
All right. Let's move on to another crisis in Australia with around inflation and the cost of living. And the Fair Work Commission this week announced a rise in the minimum wage of 5.2%, which some would say has been a long time coming. This is just above the latest inflation rate. So what do you think this rise will have, what kind of impact, do you think that this rise will have on the Australian economy, and how will it affect workers and their employers?
Well, you'll remember in the election campaign, Anthony Albanese supported a rise in line with inflation, and Scott Morrison really said he was a loose unit and was very critical of that. Well, the rise has come out just above the inflation level. Obviously, it will be welcomed by workers, but we know that inflation is going to go further up in the coming months. The Reserve Bank Governor, Philip Lowe, said this week he thought it would reach 7% by the end of the year. So workers are going, or many workers are going to be squeezed regardless of this rise. And this rise, of course, applies only to the lowest paid workers. The figure that was given for those on award wages was a bit lower than even the 5.2%. As for employers, well, some have been critical and said that the increase in the minimum wage should have been lower. They've said that some small businesses will really suffer and that this will contribute to inflation, and so you get a spiral effect.
As I mentioned earlier, Michelle, the National Cabinet is meeting today. What do you think the states are wanting out of today's meeting, and what kind of changes do you think Anthony Albanese is going to make to the National Cabinet?
What the states have been talking about is more money for health. They have health systems that are in a pretty parlous state. They've been strained by COVID. They were already not coping all that well. We've heard of ambulance ramping all over the place and long waits and so on. So health is an absolute priority. As for the National Cabinet, I think that Anthony Albanese wants a bigger role for local government. That was cut back by Scott Morrison when he went from COAG to the National Cabinet. But local government, of course, is pretty vital in delivering many services, and so having a substantial voice at the national level is useful. That may run into problems with some states, however, and in general I think that Anthony Albanese wants the National Cabinet to be much stronger in trying to drive productivity increases, because productivity is really vital in the economic growth story, and we've been falling down on this front. Now that means a bit more bureaucracy probably than National Cabinet has had. The whole aim of National Cabinet was not to have too much bureaucracy, but I think if you're going to be more ambitious in terms of issues like productivity, you probably need a sort of fuller structure.
So there's lots more to happen in that space then?
Yes, that's right.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. That is this week, or the week in politics, and I'm sure we'll see you again next week.
Thanks, Lain.